Hey everyone, my name is Sam Gambo. I'm a junior IT instructor here at Stormwind Studios, and today we're going to do a quick take look at creating a VM in GCP. And the key here is that we're really going to focus on doing it in the SDK. We're going to try to avoid the console as much as possible. And the reason for that is there are certain things that you can do in the SDK that GCP provides that you're not going to be able to specify in the console. Not only that, but there's certain things you can automate using the SDK, configurations that will be maintained throughout more configurations that you use down the road as you're creating resources and VMs that is going to be harder to configure or sometimes not even possible in the console. But let's not start at 10, let's start at 1. And what we're going to want to do first always is we're going to want to set ourselves in our configuration to the right project. So right now, if you look, I'm in a project called Sam's New Project 123. It's very original. And I'm going to use my little cheat sheet here. I've got some pre-configured scripts. That's just for speeding through this, but you're going to want to type this out at home on your own. And we're going to go over the syntax, so don't worry. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take my configuration gcloud config. All commands will start with gcloud unless it's gsutil or bq for BigQuery, gsutil for storage. But they still follow the same format. You can think of gsutil and bq as saying gcloud bq, BigQuery, or gcloud storage utility. You're still using the same syntax, they've just condensed it into those smaller words. But here we've got gcloud config, so we're going to be altering our configuration. We're going to set some property. So whatever is after is the property that we're setting. Okay? Slash project. So we are going to be taking and setting to a new project. Okay? And the project that we want to be switching to, we don't want to be in Sam's new project 123 for whatever reason. We might want to associate it with a different billing account, what have you. We need to get out of this project, right? So we want to use compute-example-project. Okay, so we're going to hit enter, and we're going to get that our property updated correctly. And what's a way that we can check that really happened? There's multitudes of ways, and you're going to want to know various ways to check what project you're on. But if you want to check what project you're using, or is set as the project for a configuration, you'll use gcloud config list, and that's going to give you some basic information. The key here being that it's giving you the project that you're on, and that's going to verify that for us, which is important. We can also see that it's even in yellow ink and it's in brackets here as well as placed right here as well. So we are in the right project. The next thing we're going to do, this is important. I've run into this problem a lot preparing for this, and practically you're going to see that you can't use or create resources unless the API for that resource is enabled. And that's going to be a problem that you're just going to hit, and there's certain APIs that you would think would be enabled by default because certain APIs are. But strangely enough, Compute Engine API, the API that you need to make a VM or use Kubernetes, creating a cluster, you need Compute Engine enabled, and it's not by default. So just remember, you can either go in the console and take the easy way out and click Enable, or you can use the command in the SDK, which is, I'm going to copy it here. gcloud services is what we're altering. We want to enable, you could also disable from the SDK, and we're going to put in the API, which is compute.googleapis.com. Okay, and that's what we're using here. Here's the service that we're enabling, compute.googleapis.com. We're going to hit enter. And this is going to take a second. This is not something that instantly happens. Even if we clicked enable in the console, it's going to take a minute. We can refresh it too, just to see, but you'll see when you enable an API, it is a process, okay? So what are we going to do now that we are in the process of enabling this API? Well, first things first, let's make sure that our shell reopens to the project that we're hoping it should. Okay. And the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to have to create an instance. Okay. And the way that we're going to do that in SDK is using the gcloud compute instances create command. Okay. And what that's going to indicate is that we want to use gcloud to affect compute, specifically instances in compute. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to give it a name. And that's where we'll stop for now. And we'll see what happens once we try to use that just by giving it a name. What's going to happen? Okay. Might try to speed this up. Oh, all right. Finished successfully. Didn't even need me. Perfect. Great. So let's try what I was talking about. Let's take gcloud compute instances create, and let's just give it a name, and that's it, right? And you'll see behind me while I'm prepping this that the API is being updated. And what I'm going to want to do in the meantime is pull up compute engine in the navigation and pull up VM instances. Okay. And this is just to show you what the console represents these SDK commands as, okay? Because right now, look, we've got no VM instances, right? So we shouldn't see anything here, and we don't. Now we could, again, we could take the easy way out, and we could just hit create, and we could go through the console, but that's not going to help us make very specific alterations to our VM. So let's see what happens if I just give it a name. gcloud compute instances create, that's the action, my first VM. Okay. So gcloud's gonna try to help us out. It's gonna do its best. It's gonna say, do you mean to give it this zone that we think would be best for you? Which in this case is US West 1-A, US West 1 being the region, and -A being the specific zone. There's 4 in US West 1. You don't have to memorize that, but that's just to help you understand how that's getting broke down. So gcloud is saying, hey, this seems like a pretty good zone for you. Do you want to use this? You might say yes, but for our sake, just to show you what happens when you're not really giving a lot of specific information and you're not feeding that to GCP, here's what's going to happen. So we'll hit no. GCP says, okay, well, here's some zones that I have that you could pick from. Choose a zone. There's numbers correlating to each one. Hopefully that works for you. So we'll put in 46 and let's see what happens. We're waiting here for a second as GCP tries to create the instance, but you'll see that there's not enough resources to fulfill that because we're trying to use a region in a zone that we can't access right now. There's not enough resources to provide the type of instance that we're asking, which we're not even specifying a machine type or a zone. So GCP is trying to help us, but we're not giving it enough information. So we could give it the bare minimum, which is a machine type and a zone that we want to use. Okay, so let me copy paste that. gcloud compute instances create. Let's try my first VM again. That still works. --zone, which is going to specify a zone. You can do a region and it'll just fill out a zone for you. But in this case, we'll give it zone US Central 1-A. I know that has enough resources for this. And -- machine type. And that's what we'll look into the console in for a second if you're not familiar with, but we can select different machine types, N1 standard 1. In this case, we're going to want to pick F1-micro. So the reason that we're using an F1 micro is just because it's just one CPU. It's very small, but reason number one is that it's free. And we want to keep, while we're doing trials and we're studying, we're working through this is a really nice way to keep your trial period of $300 and 12 months, keeping that free so you don't have to go spending money to keep practicing. So we'll use that for now. And we'll hit enter. Let's see what happens. We've specified a lot more this time. We specified a zone. We've also specified a machine type. So what should happen is we should get information on the VM that we've created. There it is, my first VM. We've got the correct zone, US Central 1-A, the machine type, F1 micro, that's what we want. Preemptible, we'll talk about that in future lessons, but that just means that the VM will turn on no more than 24 hours for batch processing, and then it will be shut off without warning. It's not covered by an SLA. It's as Google needs. They're very cheap though. You can save up to 80% by using preemptible. All you need to do is specify that in the SDK with dash dash preemptible, but there's more on that later in the full course. Next, we'll provide an internal IP address for the VPC that's set to the default network. We'll get on more on that later. All you need to know is that is for communication within the VPC, and the external IP address, which is ephemeral and automatically generated. Ephemeral meaning that it will be taken away as the VM's taken down. It's not permanent or static. And last, we have the status of the VM, which is that it's running. And not only that, but we see, thank goodness, that it's being created. This little circular taskbar here means that this instance is being staged. It's going to start running soon. We could also check that in our notifications here if it was still in the process. But once this is good, we'll get a green check mark here. We should. And that means that our VM is created. But that can honestly be a lot of work. Even scripting and keeping track of what zone you're in can be difficult as you're switching between configurations or projects, and that's a lot of man hours, and we don't want to put that in every time, right? And we also don't want to take a chance at making mistakes. That's the purpose of automation, at least in GCP, is trying to remove inconsistencies and keeping our configurations consistent and avoiding human errors and mistakes. So what is one strategy that we can take in GCP to ensure some consistency? One that is important for the exam, for the ACE exam, as well as just using GCP in general, is setting things in your configurations as we've done earlier on in this course. So what we'll do is we'll take my little cheat sheet that I've got here and we'll use gcloud config set. We've done that before, so we're going to set something, a new property in the configuration. This time though, we're going to use compute. Instead of we had core projects, now we're going to be altering compute and specifically the zone. We want to set a default zone. This is something that you'll see throughout your use with GCP, is setting certain default zones so that when you create a new resource in compute specifically, it's not going to do this for everything else. When you set it in compute instances, you're going to get that new VM that you spin up automatically in US Central 1A. You don't even have to specify that, okay? So what does that look like? Updated property compute zone, that's confirmed, right? So what we'll do is we will go into our cheat sheet here, and it's just another gcloud compute instances create script for my second VM. This is a new VM, okay? And it's going to be designated as machine type F1 micro, okay? That's all we're specifying this time, right? Let me make one quick adjustment by adding in the correct number of dashes and setting F1 micro. You need 2 dashes. That's another great point right there. If you use a single dash, you have to use the shorthand. In this lesson and throughout the course, you'll want to use 2 dashes. 1 dashes, you'll use a 1-letter shorthand, okay? But this time, notice what we haven't configured. We haven't configured a zone, which we did last time. And we shouldn't have to, because we've set that as the default for the config in the previous step. So let's hit enter, and we should see a similar outcome to last time. What we're looking to see is that the zone is US Central 1-A in the new VM that this is about to create. It might take some time, still creating another VM, so we might pause and come back if that doesn't happen in enough time. Okay, great. So let's look at what we got out of that result from entering that script to create that VM instance that we used only the SDK for, and that we hopefully we're going to get the implied zone from the configuration used for this new VM. So let's take a look. The first thing that we see is that the name is right. That's great. We specified that, but what we didn't specify was the zone, US Central 1-A. And that has been correctly configured here in this VM. When we get the result back, we get that correct zone. So that means that by using the configuration and setting a default zone in the configuration, in the future, when we alter compute instances and create new VMs, they're already going to have that zone every time unless I specify differently. Okay, if I give it a zone in, let's say, US West 1A, for example, that will put it in that zone. It won't continue to reference the default zone. Defaults are only used as the last resort when nothing else is specified. So let's look at some interesting side information that we got from this. So the machine type, that's exactly what we configured, but we'll notice that the internal IP address, if we look at the second VM that we created and we look at the console, the first IP address, internal IP address, sorry, of the first VM is just one under the second VM. And that's because since we've configured these in the same zone and we've left everything as the default, it's using the default VPC, Virtual Private Cloud. Now we'll get into what that means later, but for your knowledge right now, just know that when you use the default VPC and you keep creating instances using these default values of the zone, and they're getting put in the same zone, these new VM instances, guess what? They're also getting put into the same subnet on the internal IP address, all right? And this allows them to communicate within the VPC because the VPC is global. You don't need to route anything, but they still need to be placed in a subnet within the VPC. What is not contained in one subnet is their external IP addresses, which are ephemeral. It means that when I shut down, let's look at, what was it? It was my first VM. When I shut that down, if I create a new my first VM, it's not going to have a guarantee, or and not even that, it's probably not going to get that external IP address, right? It's going to get just another random external IP address that Google will dole out to it, right? So keep that in mind. If these IP addresses look completely out of the same subnet that you were expecting, that's how they're supposed to be in comparison to the internal IP address. And in a future lesson, we'll get more into the VPC networking of Google Cloud. But for this, I just want to show you kind of these neat little factoids that you're going to want to remember as you're taking the exam. What else do we see from here? Now we could also SSH into these instances, right? We could connect right to them once they're created. Even though I created them in the SDK, I can still connect to them through SSH in the console, right? That's the beauty, or one of the beauties of this process, right? So let's look at a few more things before we call it a day. Let's look at my first VM. And let's look at the details page of this VM. And what we're going to see is a lot of default values filled for us, but we're also going to see the things that we configured, okay? And that's the beauty of this too. We can go and look and verify here. Look, our F1 micro that we configured, which I promise you is very small. It's one virtual CPU and just a little over a half a gig of memory. It's just for bursting. We just use it because it's free. We don't want to waste our free trial credits while we're trying things out. We'll also see that the zone is represented here. But we'll also see, oh, there it is, right? We're in the default network and default subnetwork. Great. But what we'll also see is that the default boot image has been given, right? And that's a Debian 10 buster. And what that means to you is that when you create a VM using the defaults, GCP is nice to you. And it knows that you're cheap just like I'm cheap. And it knows that you don't want to spend money if you don't have to. So what's it going to do for you? It's going to help you out. It's going to give you a free image. There are paid images. Okay, there's certain paid images. There's also bring your own license. We'll get into that later, but there are paid images like certain Windows images. You're going to have to pay for that, and GCP is not going to assume that's what you want as a default. It's going to assume that you don't want to pay anything, so it's going to give you something for free. Okay. Lastly, we'll see something that I want to get into, which is service accounts. We created a VM, but the VM there's a good chance in the real world when you're using VMs that the VM is going to want access to other services. So the way GCP handles this is they take the VM and they give it a service account, which is another way of treating the VM almost like a person, right? The service account is the VM's default account that it gets, and it gets access based on IAM roles, right? So in that way, it gets treated like a member, and it can be given a certain role, and it also gets scopes that limit the availability of those roles based on the service account. Okay, and we can see those scopes here. We can't see the IAM roles configured here, but we can see the scopes that we limit the VM service account to having. Okay, so let's see what we can see. We can see that, for example, this service account for this first VM for Cloud Pub Sub, which is just a different service, that it is enabled, it has access, but let's get a little bit more in depth. Let's look at Stackdriver Logging API, which this VM will use to write to, right? We need it to be able to write to these logs. We'll get into that in another lesson, but that has to do with creating storage buckets that these logs can go into, but the VM has to be able to write to Stackdriver Logging API, have that access so that it can write down the logs that it has, and that can get exported out to a storage bucket that we create later. We can even set up scripts that we configure to have the VM on boot uh, create a bucket and start writing its logs to Stackdriver. Again, we'll get into that later, but I just want you to see that this service account that's created gets scopes created that limit the IAM roles, and in the concentric circles where they meet, that's what you're able to do. Okay, so let's pull out of here. And last but not least, this is more between me and you trying to save you some money, because you're going to be trying to keep practicing your skills and techniques in GCP, right? What's a mistake that you could make, that anybody could make while you're using this service? If you leave VMs running, as we can see, this instance is running, even though it's just an F1 micro. For this case, this is specific to F1 micros. If we leave it on for the whole month, guess what? You're going to start getting charged. And it's going to start chipping away at your free credits. You get 300. But let's say you are in the real world and you're actually having billing accounts linked to these projects, right? If you leave VMs running that aren't supposed to be running, if you don't clean up your mess after you make it, you're going to get charged, okay? So in our case, we're doing it because we don't want to run up our free billing account or our free credits while we're using this trial, because we want to be able to keep studying without crossing our fingers that we don't go over the limit. And this I will do in the console because it's easier for me right now. So you caught me, I'm cheating. I'm going to delete both of these VMs. It might take a second, but what we'll see is that the process has started, and we can check it in our notifications here that we're in those processes right now. That can help us verify. So lastly, what I want to say is thank you for joining me for this quick take on GCP and creating VM instances using the SDK. What I wanted to show you was that you don't need to be touching the console always. Honestly, there's going to be times where you don't have access to the console, or there's going to be times where there's things you need to configure in the SDK that you can't configure in the console, or you want to automate those processes so that as you configure new VMs, you don't have to specify things in the console every time. You can just come into the SDK, use the configuration settings that you have, and start creating VMs faster. Okay, so once again, my name is Sam Gamboa. I'm a junior IT instructor here at Stormwind Studios. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again.